consumer has changed the way that they view their food and the type of food that they want to buy. So this survey was done by Cargill. I want to show you this. They use the term antibiotic-free beef. That means an animal that has never been treated with antibiotics. Okay? So if an animal gets sick and it gets treated, it can't go into this deal. So if we look at Brazil, almost 70% of people said that they would prefer to buy and eat antibiotic-free beef. In the United States, 54% of people said that's what they would prefer to buy and eat. Now we have a little bit of a problem in the small print here, because only 35% of that people was willing to pay more for it. So what do people do when we have big numbers and little dollars? Well, they lobby and they make a law. And that's how we got to where we're at today. So we'll talk a little bit about why there's pressure on antibiotics, but I want to talk about the other side of the coin. There's a bunch of these people that are and have the means to pay more for the food. So it creates some niche market opportunities for us as producers to produce a beef that carries a specific sticker that says non-GMO or grass-fed or whatever. And these are markets that we need to explore. And we need to exploit it because those people want it. And if we don't give it, they'll import it from somewhere where people are willing to do that. All right, so the reason why we're seeing the pressure on antibiotic use is because of this horrible word. You'll see this more and more, is antimicrobial resistance, AMR. And basically what this means is it's just the bacteria that we treat with antibiotics develop mechanisms by which they overcome the antibiotics that we use. And there's a couple of things that they do. Those bacteria can modify the antibiotic, so they develop a system to modify that antibiotic and make it less toxic. They can actually produce enzymes that will destroy the antibiotic, and the antibiotic wouldn't kill them anymore. Or they develop what they call an efflux pump. So as the antibiotic goes into it, they open a little tap, just let it flow right through without working. And the big reason why we have a problem is these bacteria have found a way to pass these mechanisms on to each other. So in a population, the bacteria that develop these things and they don't get killed, they will pass that on to other bacteria, and very soon, in that specific population of bacteria, that antibiotic doesn't work anymore. So why does that concern us? Well, the problem is that the effectiveness of several antibiotics in human health is declining. That's where the big pressure came from. Is we're finding that some of these diseases like tuberculosis, you have this multiple strain resistant tuberculosis that they don't have a drug that'll kill it anymore. Now, this is not our fault. But this is a problem that we also face, is the effectiveness of several antimicrobials that we use in animal health are declining. How many of you still use tetracycline when you have a very expensive animal that has bad pneumonia? I mean, there are better drugs that we can use because sometimes that just doesn't do it anymore. So basically what has happened is all these antimicrobial resistance deals in medically important antibiotics that apply to humans, those classes of antibiotics are being reviewed. Doctors will face some legislation where they can't give antibiotics that easily, but also they're going to limit how we access those things, okay? And it's a global thing. The World Health Organization is in on this deal. It's not the US only, it's all over the world that people are struggling with this thing. So what do? Well, first one is the improving awareness of this antimicrobial resistance amongst everybody, and that's where the consumers go scared because they don't understand what these people are saying. So we need to make sure that we understand this and we can tell a consumer, listen, our beef is safe. We have withholding periods on all our antibiotics. We adhere to that, and we produce a safe product for you. Definitely most countries in the first world are building national capacity to have surveillance on this, to see how bad it is with which antibiotic. And then obviously they're strengthening regulations to make sure we don't exacerbate this. And then they do promote good practices to help with this. So in the US, the FDA is in charge of this thing to oversee this. And basically what they do is, they've been put under pressure to act on this, and that train has left. So January 1 next year, we will have the veterinary fee directive kick in. And in my opinion, it is the first step of several steps. I think eventually in future, the purchase of oxytetracycline injectable and penicillin over the counter, that thing is going to disappear at some point. And the mass use of antibiotics in animals that are not sick is going to come under pressure as well. So what can we do to turn this thing around a little bit? And I think this is where we need to think carefully. These things are doable. So if we look at any disease, there's really three things that you can do to manage disease. The first one is to reduce exposure. There was a gentleman here yesterday afternoon that spoke about scours in calves. If we have a scour outbreak and we keep all the cows calving in that same environment, it's a losing battle, because who gives it to the guy who receives it. So it just keeps going and going and going. So reduction of exposure is something we can do. There are management processes that we can do to reduce exposure. This is a big one. And I'm going to take 2 minutes to explain to you why we need to talk about reducing stress. It's a very simple thing. Whenever you stress an animal, the first thing that it'll do is it will produce cortisol. And that chemical cortisol, the first thing it'll do is it'll shut down the immune system. Because under stress, you need to fight for survival. Getting sick is really low at the totem pole when you have a big stressful event. So the problem is that we need to find a way to manage cortisol. So when do we see big spikes in cortisol? Well, every time we handle cattle. So is there a way that we can get educated to work cattle better? Less handling, less stress? How do we wean calves? We're going to talk about that a little bit now. But this is really key. If we can manage cortisol and not have these big spikes and not rev cattle up so they produce a lot of cortisol, we have an opportunity to have a better immune system. And then this last one is where most of the research dollars is going into, is finding ways to improve the disease-fighting capabilities of cattle. So this is where we're looking at what can we do with a vaccine? What can we do with immune modulators? Is there any way that we can help the animal to use its inherent capabilities to fight the disease better? When we talk about reduction of exposure, what are we talking about? Well, the first one is good fences makes good neighbors, because if you can control what comes onto your property, you contain any threat or any pathogen that comes in with cattle outside. Trick testing bulls, I don't think that's something we need to debate. If you buy a bull and he's not trick tested, you may bring a very bad thing to your operation. Test and remove BVD PI animals. Second to cortisol, this is the biggest immune suppression that we see in cattle. If you have a BVD PI animal, what it does is it consistently just sheds virus. That virus will go into healthy cattle, it'll suppress their immune system, and it's very simple. It just wipes out all the T cells. Now that cattle is susceptible to IBR, pneumonia, whatever, because the immune system doesn't work. Purchase replacements from reliable sources. Purchase disease-tested or vaccinated animals. And this is a very simple one, which can save you a lot of heartache. How often is it that we buy new cattle and we just shove them into a herd? If you could keep them for 30 days, most incubation periods of diseases or not longer than 30 days. So if you keep them segregated and they get sick, at least they're not going to transmit some of that bugs to your herd. I'm not going to talk about these things, but really, if we look at respiratory disease in cattle, pneumonia, it is almost like climbing a staircase. It has three components to it. The first one is, if we look at Mannheimia and Pasturella, every bovine that we stick a little swab up its nose, we're going to find that there. All mama cows have it. It's an inherent bug that lives in cattle. Why don't they get sick? Well, it doesn't progress into the lungs. For this thing to become a problem, we need something to suppress the immune system, so we need a little bit of stress. And then we may need a virus to make that air passages susceptible. And very soon, these will go in and really harm the lungs. So the problem is, this is one thing we cannot reduce. So the only way that we manage this is we try and upscale the immune system in calves, because the two big guns that cause the damage, they'll get it from the cows. Talking about reducing stress, a very simple principle. There's been a couple of studies published on this. Anytime we work calves, the quicker we can get that calf back to the cow, the quicker that calf will drop its cortisol levels again. So don't try and separate them and keep them apart for a long time and then work them and then try and get them back to the cows. The quicker you can get them back, the quicker that stress level goes down. When we look at weaning, this is the second most stressful event you can do to cattle. The only thing that beats this on stress is a cow popping a calf. That's the only thing that's more stressful than weaning a calf. How many of you do anything like this where you manage the stress on weaning? Fence line weaning or the two-step with a flap or something? You feel it provides benefit? It definitely does. There's lots and lots of papers out there. I know it's a little bit more labor, but the thing is, the consumer that buys our beef, he doesn't worry about how hard we work. He just doesn't want antibiotics in his beef. So we need to explore these things and see how many of these things we can utilize. You have great opportunity with great people in Montana that develop these low stress cattle handling techniques. These are things that help, just the way we do things. I'm talking about another thing that has caught on, and several companies have different programs in place with preconditioning. And preconditioning really, it has three legs. If one of those legs are missing, it's not preconditioning. So the first one is vaccination. So we need to put something into those calves that'll enhance the immune system or expose the immune system to the diseases that we want them protected from. The second thing is we need to wean them in a fashion that doesn't induce additional stress. So this fence line weaning or something like that really helps to make for a good preconditioning process. And then a big one is we need to get those calves to learn what a trough is so they can eat out of a bunk. So that is definitely the third one. If we look at disease fighting capabilities, really what we're talking about here is, okay, so now we're going to start messing with the immune system. We're going to show the immune system some pathogens, and they need to provide protection against these bugs. Immune system, it is something that is nutrient expecting. For the immune system to work, it requires inputs. You don't get something for nothing. So the big thing is we need water, energy, protein, macro minerals, vitamins, and trace minerals for the immune system to properly function. Now, we're going to do some sexy science, so I'm going to show you a couple of things. But really, the immune system is made up of two very distinct parts. So the first part of the immune system is something which the dear Lord has given us for free. We all have it, all cattle has it, and there's a couple of pieces to that part. So the innate immune system is something that we all have, and all our animals have it, so we just need to look after it. So it consists of two different parts. The first one is how the body is built. So we have some barriers that keep bugs out. And then we also have how the body responds, and there are certain cells in there that every calf is born with. If we can take care of those cells, it'll help that calf to overcome certain challenges. And then we have the acquired immune system, which is a completely separate division, and that is where we employ vaccines, and we get antibodies, and we get certain cells that'll go wipe out the bugs when our cattle gets challenged with them. Right, so this is how thick a skin is. I mean, this is just bunches and bunches and bunches of cells that a bug has to beat and get to get in. That's the same thing in the gut. So if you can keep your skin and gut healthy, you won't get those big challenges. Why do I show you this? Because if we neglect zinc or selenium, well, epithelium is the first thing to go. So unfortunately, if we have those deficiencies, we'll just make cattle more susceptible to disease. So as we are all in this room, this is taking place right now. This little deal here is a neutrophil. It's a cell that is in each calf, each cow, each human. It flows through our bloodstream with blood as the heart pumps. As soon as there is an infection anywhere in the body, they change their behavior. What they do is, instead of blowing past, they start fixing themselves to the wall of the blood vessel. And they stop. They crawl very slowly, and they attach to this inside of the blood vessel. Then they will crawl through that blood vessel, and they'll be inside the tissue to go find the bugs and kill them. And then they have a job to do, because once they have gone into this tissue, they need to go find the bugs, eat them, and then kill them. So this is just another picture of this thing. It'll flow through the blood until there's an area of infection. As soon as it reaches the area of infection, there's some chemical messengers that'll tell them, listen, there's something wrong on the other side of this blood vessel. And as soon as it gets there, it'll stop. It'll fix itself to that wall, and then it'll start talking to the inside of that blood vessel, and it'll open it up, and you'll see that it'll just pop through there. We'll just give it a little bit of time to talk to it. And you're going to say, well, why in the hell is this dude showing us this stuff? How many of you have ever heard about a product called Zelnate from Bayer? Okay? What Zelnate does is you inject it in cattle to piss off these dudes. It uses the animal's natural immune system to go fight bacteria. So what Zelnate does is it sends a lot of these things to the lungs. And this thing will, once it finds these bugs, it now has a second job to do. I'll get back to this slide just now. But once it gets to the bug, it'll actually eat it. It'll ingest it. Why is it important to know this? Well, this is an electron microscope slide of all those little deals that's supposed to get out in a calf that's selenium deficient. What's the problem here? We have very few of them that are outside. So the problem is, if we don't have enough selenium, we have a big problem, because all the soldiers are on the truck. None of them are getting off. So if you put Zelnate into a calf that is selenium deficient, it won't work. It's going to get the soldiers to the site of infection, but they're just going to do nothing. So just to explain the immune system that animals have, how does that work? So we need those dudes to get to the site of infection. For them to get to the site of infection, we need selenium. Then you remember that second video where they had to eat the bugs? To eat the bugs, they need copper. So we need to get them to the site of infection, and then we need them to do something. We need selenium and copper for those two deals. And then for them to actually kill the bug, they need copper, zinc, and selenium. So this is the system we have for free. Now we're going to change gears a little bit, and I want to show you this. If we don't have the system to help them kill bugs, what happens? How many of you have seen a calf that had bad pneumonia, died? You open it up, half the lung looks like a piece of liver. Doesn't look like lung anymore. That is exactly what happened here. So what happens is you don't have enough antioxidants to help the white cells to fight that infection. And that tissue actually gets killed by those bacteria. Right. Now we change gears 100%. We now know that selenium, copper, and zinc are really important for the innate immune system, the stuff we get for free. So if we take care of that, the innate immune system should work pretty good. Now we talk about vaccines, because now we're going to help the immune system to do two things. Number one, we're going to make it recognize the disease. It's a little more specific. The second thing is, if we use a vaccine, the animal already knows what's coming. So when it gets challenged, it's going to respond fast. So the vaccine gives you two things. It gives you very specific protection and gives you very fast action. So let's look at how this deal works. So once we put a vaccine into an animal, the stuff that we put in there is usually a bug that's been weakened, so it doesn't make the animal sick. And that bug then needs to be transported by this little red blot here. They call it an antigen presenting cell. It takes it into a big lymph node. Lymph nodes are the factories where immune system function is done. So when we look at lymph nodes, they are critical, because inside that lymph node, two things happen. The first thing is all of the antibodies that are being produced, those B cells are activated in the lymph node. The second thing is also all the memory is produced there. So where do we find these lymph nodes or glands? The single most important one that we use in cattle is the pre-scap that sits just in front of the shoulder. It sits on either side, just in front of the shoulder. So if you have a head gait that bruises the shoulders really bad, do you think this thing is going to work well? Very often when you vaccinate cattle and they limp a little bit a day or two afterwards, you kind of wonder, why in the hell would that be? They seem a little stiff or something. Well, what's happening is you put the vaccine in the neck, it was carried into these regional lymph nodes, and they're working. They increase in size a little bit, a lot of activity going on there, but it's at a place where there's a lot of movement. It's a little sore. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, it just shows you it's working. But the one point I want to leave you with is, don't damage those pre-scap lymph nodes. They're the factories where your protection is going to come from. So just look at the equipment so we don't damage those things. Right. I'm going to leave this picture and go on to this one. These antibodies we're talking about, what's their job? When we produce a bunch of antibody, when that bug gets into the cattle, the antibodies will attach to it just like a magnet will attach to a nail. And now, this thing is too big, it can't go into the cell. So it prevents infection. So IBR, BVD, parainfluenza, Mannheimia, trike, all of those things, we have a component of antibody that we need to protect against disease. Killed antigens is different. If we use a modified live, what does it do? Well, when we stick a modified live vaccine in there, it's replicating. It's modified live virus. It's perpetuating itself. And it'll keep replicating until the system is ramped up to the point where it can put a lid on it and wipe it out. So that's why modified live vaccines are really good. They only need to be used at irregular intervals. The label is not very specific that you need to do it and repeat again after 4 weeks. But with our killed vaccines, they all carry that label, that you have to do it and repeat it after a month. Why is that? Well, they don't replicate. So we put a limited number of bugs in here, and that first response is kind of small. It produces a lot of memory, but not a huge protection. The second time we come around, we blow it out of the water with protection. So if you buy a kilt vaccine and the label says give 2 doses and you give 1, you've only done half the job. It's not going to work great. We can leave that one. So basically when we do research and we look at things that we can do to help the immune response, in the individual calf, we have tests that we can measure how much antibody we produce in that calf. We have tests that we can use to determine how much cell-mediated immunity we induce in that calf. But what we do is we vaccinate whole populations. So there's something else that we need to look at. Because not only do we need to look at what do we do in an individual animal, is it good or not good, but most importantly, we need to also know how wide we're casting the net. Because very often when we vaccinate a group of cattle, there's a bunch of them that's not going to respond the way we think they are. This is one of the contributing factors to that. Age has a very big impact on the mineral status of a beef calf. So when a beef calf is born, the cow will really put in a major effort to make sure that that calf is well stacked with trace mineral. And the reason she does that is because cow's milk is exceptionally poor in these trace minerals. It doesn't have any of it. So she will pre-stack it. The problem is, as that calf starts growing, by about 56 days of age, it'll have burned through 3/4 of the mineral it was born with. And that decline continues right up to weaning. And we have these 3, what I call risk areas, because the first thing is, if we have a cow that was neglected, that calf is going to be born with a lower level. It's going to really become deficient pretty quick. And we typically see that if cows were neglected, and we see these very early, very bad scour breaks, it's because these calves just don't have a functioning immune system. That free stuff that we have, the cells that are traveling and doing stuff, they just don't do that because we don't have enough selenium and copper in those calves. At this point, this is where we start most often using some of our calf food vaccines. So at this 2 to 3 months of age, that's when we do some branding vaccines, and then this is the second place where we put a lot of vaccine into calves, is at weaning. So we just need to pay attention to what the levels of these calves are. And this is how maternal antibodies, this is why we time it the way we time it. Because if we vaccinated a cow really well, as soon as that calf drinks colostrum, it's going to get some protection. So this is protection levels against BVD and IBR. And you can see once the calf has good colostrum in it, it's pretty high, but it declines pretty fast. And around this 2-3 month deal is where it typically will drop 50%. And that is why at that point, it's safe to use a vaccine, because this will not interfere with the way your vaccine works. That's why we do it at that time. Now, unfortunately, this is the time of a perfect storm, because I just showed you that's exactly the time when we kind of fall out the bottom with the trace minerals. So we need to just make sure that we address that deal. This was a study I did with John Arthington out of Florida, because they couldn't understand why they had calves that got sick 6 to 8 weeks after vaccinating them. Damn it, man, we've just put something good in them. We turn them out, and now they get sick 6 weeks later. Why in the hell would they do that? The vaccine was fine. Nothing wrong with the vaccine. The one thing we found is that if you stick a modified live into a beef calf, the levels of zinc and selenium drop significantly 2 weeks after you vaccinate them. So if we back it up here, if we take this calf and we stick a vaccine into it, we're going to drop this thing a little sharper just 2 weeks after we've done that. If they then get a challenge, now we have a calf that didn't really respond great to the vaccine, and the fuel for free stuff, we've just wiped that out. So now they're super susceptible. So just to explain what we then did is we used those same calves, or a subgroup of them, and we injected the trace mineral at the same time that we put the vaccine in. And you can see we can almost double the zinc levels in those cattle. We can actually turn the tide on copper. Instead of going down, it goes up. And with selenium the same, instead of going down, it actually goes up. So there is technology out there that you can use to fix this little wobble that we run into at 2 to 3 months of age. And this is a critical one, because if you get all the vaccines to work well here, you're set up good for moving this way. But if those vaccines don't perform well here, that's when weaning becomes a little bit of a drag. So when we look at it, typically what we would expect is, if we vaccinate 6 calves, we'd like them all to respond the same way. But this is what happens in real life. There's always some calves that are genetically inclined to never respond to a vaccine. They will just not respond, or to a certain component in that vaccine. So you may vaccinate all your calves against BVD, but there may be 1 or 2 in that herd that'll always be susceptible. None of these vaccines can trigger the immune response to the point where we have 100% of these animals being protected. But on the other hand, we also have some calves that mount a massive immune response, and they don't ever need to be vaccinated. Now, if I could find a dipstick that could measure these two, I'd be a wealthy man and I wouldn't be talking to you here. But it's not that easy. We cannot identify them very easily. For the most of it, they'll respond as the product is published, or maybe just a little weaker. But we have variability. It's not all or nothing, and it's not all the same. So what I want to talk to you is, when we talk about population dynamics, or we talk about people talking about vaccine research, they need to show you 2 things. Because when we use a vaccine, well, I would like to know, whatever the hell you're telling me, what does it do in the animal in one calf? So in this calf, did it make things better, quicker, earlier, higher? What did it do? But then I think the second point is, I would like to see something about your population data. Because if we do it all better in one calf out of 100, that doesn't really help me as a cattleman. So I think that's something you need to ask your vaccine guys as we move along into the future, is we need to start looking also at population data. Is it helping the population? Are we getting more calves to respond better? That's an important thing. And then I guess where the rubber meets the road is, well, it's all great if you can show me it does stuff better, higher, quicker, whatever. But when we put the disease into those calves, does it really help to protect them? That's where the rubber meets the road. They need to be able to show you some challenge data where we actually put the virus into the calf to try and make it sick. Because if we try and make it sick and the vaccine works, it's a slam dunk. Because then it shows that disease is not there. And then we need to look at bigger population studies to see if we do it in bigger groups of cattle, can we reduce the number that gets sick? So I want to show you a couple pieces of data so that we just cover off all of these points and not give you half bits and pieces of information. So this is work we've done where at the exact same day as giving a vaccine, we put an injectable trace mineral in the same calf. So basically what the idea was is to say, well, we know that when we put the vaccine in there, these calves are going to need these minerals to respond to it. If we give it to them at the same time, does it help? Does it do anything? So a couple of points I want to make is, this was IBR, red nose or bovine herpes virus. You can see we drive the production of titers significantly higher, and at least for a 60-day period, it stays higher. If we look at the cell-mediated immune response, we get it up quicker and it stays up higher. With BVD, we see exactly the same thing. The first response is bigger, the second response is bigger. So that's all really romantic stuff I just showed you, because it doesn't really give anything, does it? This was something we found valuable, because if we look at putting a modified live into a group of calves, 53% of calves had we call it, for them to show that they've mounted an adequate immune response, they need to take whatever they have, multiply it by 4-fold to show that they've mounted a good response. So after vaccinating with a modified live, 53% of cattle did that 4 weeks after they were vaccinated. If you put the injectable trace mineral with it, 80% of cattle did that. So we can get more cattle to mount that response compared to cattle that did not get the food for the whole process. And this cuts down on the number of times you have to vaccinate, because what you have to do is, the ones you missed on this round, you'll have to go do it again to make sure you get wider exposure of those cattle. And then we challenged these cattle. So we put virulent virus in their noses. We did 2 different studies. We did one with dairy calves and one with beef calves. So if we look at fever, if we don't use a vaccine and we put virulent BVD into a calf's nose, damn, they get sick. You see, after you put that virus in, 72 hours later, they start developing a very, very nice fever. So if you don't use a vaccine, they get pretty sick. If we use a vaccine with no mineral added to the injected with it, well, they don't get that sick because the vaccine's working. If we put the vaccine and the injectable mineral, it's very much the same. So there's nothing really wow there. But if we start looking at how many of these calves are starting to shed virus through the nose and producing BVD diarrhea, the injectable is starting to show, they don't get quite that sick. But this is still very romantic information, because you don't sell, oh, my calf didn't have such a bad scour. This is what you sell, average daily gain. So when we look at this is, if we look at how these cattle performed, if we put the mineral with the vaccine, that's where you had the biggest growth. The animals that just had the vaccine was slightly lower, and obviously the ones that didn't have vaccine, they got really sick and they didn't perform that well. So the bottom line is, if you put something else with a vaccine and make it work better, you may not measure it in fevers and cells and stuff, but cattle performance gets better. This was a study we did in 2011 at the University of Arkansas on high-stress heifers. Lots of cattle got sick. It was a hell of a deal. These were all these 3-4 weight heifers that you got from a sale barn, put it into a stocker outfit. And what I want to show you is, if they didn't get any mineral, about 87% of them got sick. If we gave them the Multimin, about 54 got sick. But what I want to show you is, let's look at how many needed treatment with a second and a third antibiotic. 51, 32 versus 19 and 9. The cost of antibiotics, $13 in that group, $8 in that group. So just the saving in antibiotics here already paid for the product, and you had a profit. And we thought, well, okay, so this is a little excessive, because this was one hell of a challenge. What if we have cattle that are not stressed that bad? So we repeated that study at Texas A&M, and we used a bunch of steers and bull calves, and you can see that, well, now that we have a group that didn't get quite that sick, the stress wasn't that bad, 15% of them got sick, needed an antibiotic once. Well, if we fed them, if we injected the mineral as well, we could cut that by 3%. The number treated twice, well, we didn't have any. Obviously, the antibiotic cost was significantly less at $4.60 there, but again, $1.50 saving there. So there's mounting evidence that this helping the immune system, giving this stuff at the same time as the vaccine, not only does it help the individual cattle to respond a little quicker and better, but in real world situations where we actually challenge these cattle and put them through a stressful event after that, you'll save some money on antibiotics and sickness, and there's a way to make money out of this thing. So I think, and I hope, that what I shared with you here today is to show you that it's not that bad. We're always going to use antibiotics when cattle get sick. But I think there's a whole toolbox of things we can do out there if we just think about how we manage these things to make it better. So in concluding, I want to leave you with the three things. So number one is reduce exposure as best you can. If you get a sick animal, get him out of the group as fast as you can. Number two, let's limit stress. How do we handle cattle? How do we wean? How do we work with them? And number three, when we use vaccines, I need you to look at new technologies that we can apply with vaccine to see if we can, number one, have the animal respond better, have more animals respond better, and in doing that, have cattle just, whenever they get challenged, not to take as big a hit as they would being unprotected.